What is an American person? A simple Google search brings up top images that feature the same thing: a middle aged white male. The US government pushed this image in their Americanization programs that were intended to make someone American. Americanization programs began in the early 20th century and fluctuated in popularity amidst the Great Depression and the two World Wars. Mexicans, therefore, had to try their best to accept the white man's changing capitalistic values. The issue was that many of the people they targeted were already American, they just weren't white. Ideas of Americanization ranged from moronic ideas of Mexican food causing crime, because a good tortilla and frijoles always makes you a gang member, to providing education for children, particularly in learning English. An expert on Mexicans, white male writer Merton E. Hill describes the Americanization program in San Bernardino County as one that should educate and train Mexicans to work with their hands, and in particular for Mexican women to become domestic servants. This, he argues, is the best possible standard of American life. Careful there, Mr. Hill. Your thinly veiled racism and sexism are shining through your false activism for Mexicans. His specific targeting of Mexican women cannot be accredited solely to his sexism. The targeting of women and children in Americanization programs was crucial in order for them to create a second generation of true Americans. As James Barrett, yet another expert white male, states in his journal article, Americanization from the Bottom Up, the idea of true Americans stemmed from the racist belief that Americans should be English speakers and adhere to white standards of society. Vicky Ruiz, in her book From Out of the Shadows, Mexican Women in 20th Century America, shines some light on what really happened in Americanization programs. Mexicans yeeted on the programs, used up its benefits, and maintained their Mexican core values. Essentially, Mexicans now had education, the English language mastered, and a realization that the whites were holding out on them with the American dream. As new woke generations of true Americans were born, it would eventually lead to the Chicano movement of the 60s. This movement included, but was not limited to, school walkouts to protest lack of opportunities for Chicana and Chicano students, protests for farm workers' rights, and demands for better access to Latinx history. The movement achieved many civil rights for Mexican Americans, but we'll stick to talking about what was new and trendy in 1920s America. Intercolonization, a term Ruiz pegs to describe the attempt by Americans to colonize the very culture of the Mexican people, since they had already economically colonized Mexico. Americanization programs were essentially the way white and or privileged people attempted to intercolonize and train Mexicans to stay in their lower social and racial class by training them to be manual laborers and maids or servants. As the emergent Chicano movement of the 60s proved, however, Americanization programs for the most part failed. However much they failed, Americanization programs were inherently classist in keeping Mexican social mobility low, racist in their discrimination against Mexicans, and sexist in their treatment of women. And then the 1930s came. The Great Depression changed the way Mexicans were treated. Suddenly, they were no longer the assimilable brown people, but the job-stealing immigrants who needed to leave the country. A mass repatriation, sending back people to their origin country, began in the 1930s. Of those repatriated, 60% were Mexican Americans. Our white writer, Merton Hill, really helped to highlight the differences between Americanization programs and the mass repatriation that occurred in the 1930s. Despite being racist, sexist, and classist, he was at least in favor of Mexicans remaining in the States, whereas the repatriation that were to follow in that same decade brought conflicting ideas as to how exactly the US wanted to use Mexicans in the 1930s. Were they all to be returned to a failing economy for working class peoples in Mexico? Or were they to be integrated as low-wage laborers and second-class citizens in the US? The question posed with Americanization programs and the mass 1930s repatriation is, ¿Qué son? ¿Mexicanos, Americanos, o Mexicanos Americanos? What are they? Mexican, American, or Mexican American?